Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cinema Chicago member screening series. You've just finished watching the film Zappa, and we are thrilled to welcome virtually director Alex Winter. Alex, welcome to our virtual screening series.
Thank you so much. Very sorry I couldn't be there. I left Chicago.
We'll have to bring you back when the public health situation is a little bit better. First of all, I just want to say congratulations on the film. I know it was like a kind of a tumultuous journey to get a film released in these uncertain times. So we're so glad that you're able to share it with everybody.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
So I just want to start about the beginnings of the project. I know it was, I'm curious about your initial sort of impetus for making a film about Zappa. Why now? And then I know it was like kind of a larger project about the Zappa, sort of centered around the Zappa vault. Could you talk about like early days and what sort of inspired you to make the project?
Yeah, they're a little connected in the sense that I was coming off a dog. I mean, I started working on this 6 years ago, and I was coming off a dog project that was quite intense about a crime in the digital space called Deep Web. And my producer and I were looking for something that was not tech related, and we were wondering why no one had done the Zappa story. Why? I mean, I was familiar with Zappa growing up in the '70s, and then I got much more into his music and a deeper sense of his art as I got older. But even when I was young, he was this captivating figure who was as interested into politics and activism and satire as he was a brilliant musician. And that was the kind of person I was very much drawn to. But he seemed like a great doc character subject, specifically because he had this extraordinary personal life as an artist, and but he also had this extremely specific relationship to the times in which he lived. And it's not common to find those two things together. And I was very interested in doing a doc about that period in American history and about trying to make art in that period in American history. And so Zappa really fit that need, that desire that I had to tell that specific story. I pitched the idea to Gail Zappa, Frank's widow, who ran, if you've seen the film, you know, she was a force of nature who ran the label through most of his life and all posthumously until she sadly passed of cancer in 2015. And Gail happened to really like my take. She said it wasn't what she commonly got people asking. But she said if I wanted to tell that story, if I was interested in telling a kind of story about interiority and not sort of more the superficial kind of legacy aspects of his life, that I would need the vault, that Frank was so protective of his image that most of that type of thing that spoke to who he actually was as a person was not public, and not the kind of stuff doc filmmakers normally can just go find. And thus began a 2-year preservation project of just preserving media in the vault. It took us, me and my team, a solid 2 years after 8 to 10 months of doing a Kickstarter campaign to raise the money to preserve the vault media.
And the media in the vault, you're talking about like, this is not just like tape, but film and all kinds of like different kinds of materials, or are you just preserving the music and recordings and things?
Not at all. You know, most of what I was interested in wasn't the music. That was stuff the family had been preserving and working on for, you know, the decades since his passing. There was a vast amount of physical visual media, 8mm. He started, you've seen the film, we talk about it, but he really, his artistic interest began with film, and he was an avid film buff. He shot a lot of 8mm and Super 8. He also would take pre-existing films, either of his family or other movies, and he would cut them up. He would intercut them, splice them. The media that we were dealing with was 8mm, Super 8, 16, 35, just the mag sound. Then you get into every conceivable kind of video, because he was an innovator with video, going back to the very beginning of reel-to-reel video. And all of that deteriorates very quickly. And I smelled vinegar the second I walked into the vault and realized that we were up against the clock. So it was a titanic effort, and required going to dozens of proprietary preservation companies that each one did only that media. So someone different did 1-inch and someone different did 2-inch video. Gives you an idea of how complicated this process was.
Yeah, and I think some of the material that's showcased in the film speaks to the fact that Zappa was truly a visual innovator, and I think it makes sort of a film the perfect medium for like telling the Zappa story and putting it in this like larger context of his creative mind. Those like the collages, I'm assuming that's all Zappa footage, right? The transition like collages that, or was that stuff you pieced together yourself? It's very beautiful.
Oh, thanks. It's both. What we did was Mike Nichols, the editor, and I we were watching. Mike was on from the very beginning, even when I pitched Gail. We were framing how to do this, and Mike and I started watching the footage as we were preserving it, and we were finding the beautiful, beautiful home movie footage that he was shooting, and very Brackage like drawing on, cutting, collaging, very artistically. It was adept. He was probably no more than 13 or 14 when he was making some of the stuff, and some was later. But the key for us was his style in dealing with film was very similar to his style in dealing with music, and so we began to take a lead off of that, and then we started making our own. So probably the majority of what you saw was actually us, but it was us manipulating footage that he shot, intermixed with footage that he edited. And that's one of the interesting things that we discovered when we preserved the vault, was that Frank would take a piece that he shot in 8 mm when he was 14. He would recut it when he was 20. He would put it on the video when he was 30. He would recut that video, right, and make a whole new thing out. And this was not for public consumption. Family didn't even know this existed. And then he would move that from, let's say, 3/4 video to 1 inch, and then on to digibeta. And then once it was on digibeta, he'd make it something else out of it.
Yeah.
Like he would color it. And so we were using all of that. We were literally making art from his art wherever we possibly could.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that like step-by-step process, and then like this final manipulation, or maybe not final, but this manipulation you've done that makes it this kind of living organism. Yeah, very
Yeah.
beautiful the way that the film moves. I want to ask about the family, because this is kind of, because it is like an unconventional music doc. It's not paint by numbers, rags to riches story. Can you talk about, like, did you face any kind of pushback from the family because it wasn't such like a rosy portrait of Zappa? I mean, I don't think it's a negative portrait of him by any means, but like it's an even-handed look, I think.
So because when I first, I mean, I really just needed to get the rights from Gail. She was the rights holder, and we were an independent film that we were completely separate and unto ourselves, and I had final cut. So when I sat down with Gail the very first time, before I knew she was going to even say yes, I was very blunt about wanting to make a warts and all portrait. But you know, you're not dealing with wallflowers, and Zappa isn't the kind of legacy artist that was creating mythos around his image. He was, you know, one of the reasons I liked him and wanted to make a film about him is he was the opposite of that. He was anti-mythos. He was anti-movement. He did not want to belong to the hippie movement. He did not want to belong to the New York art scene in the 60s. He did not want to go and be part of Bill Graham's San Francisco scene. He was extremely concerned about being who he was and the truth of his art. And that doesn't mean he was more or less truthful than other people who were in those movements. This is just who he was, right? It's idiosyncratic. That's what I liked about that aspect of his nature. So I had a feeling that Gail wasn't going to be someone who said, "Oh no, I don't want these things known," when they've spent their whole careers basically tearing down the barriers that rock and roll musicians usually put up around themselves. That was a big part of who Frank was. And in the film, you can see that he's constantly ribbing other artists for being too haughty or in their ivory tower, not really knowing how their contracts are written. So I didn't get any pushback. In fact, Gail was very glad that I was going to do that. I do think once I sat down with her eyeball to eyeball, I think it was emotional for her to talk about his infidelity, and I was respectful of that and sensitive to it. But I didn't ever receive pushback from her on that.
Yeah, I think the interviews, just as like this backbone of the film, the interviews with all the people who knew him, who were sort of in his orbit, I think it's almost like this even-handed portrait just sort of comes out of them, because it seems like so many of them are conflicted about, like, you can tell there's some like animosity there, but like this like connective thread is that there's almost like a reverence for just like the kind of work he was producing and his work ethic and stuff like that. Can you talk about the interview process and talking to all those folks who were like, maybe?
Yeah, I can. And you hit upon exactly, what I was hoping to get. Certainly not what I was manipulating to get. But Zappa is a man of dualities, like any human being. Every human being is paradoxical and inherently dualistic on many levels. Zappa was so outwardly that way that he makes a great portrait subject, because he's representative of the human condition writ large in a way. And I had a feeling the interviews were going to go this way, but I really did not want many interviews. I wanted as few interviews as I could possibly get away with. And I only wanted to speak to people who I knew Zappa's interior life intimately, from his early days clean through to his death, if possible. But not people who didn't have an ironclad grip on who the guy actually was, going back to sort of the beginning of his career. So that's really the only people I had on my list, and it was a small list. And what would happen often with these subjects, not all of them, but most of them, is they hadn't talked about Zappa in some time. They would sit in front of the camera, and for the first 20 minutes, they would just spew their rage. And that's fine. I wanted that. I wanted their anger. That's all good. It's honest and it's real. But about halfway through the interview, they would start to kind of, they would shift naturally. I would guide them a little, but it was natural. And they would start to, concede that it was, one of the most important periods of their life. By the end, they were like in tears and just like, he was the greatest man. I loved him so much. I was never able to replace what he represented in my life. And he brought my art out in a way no one else could, blah, blah, blah. And that was, in a sense, what the portrait was. I assumed growing up and hearing that Zappa was this aloof martinet and he was an asshole and no one could work with him. I assumed that wasn't accurate. And that was only one side of who he was, because he was so interested in demystifying the rock experience. There were so many things about him that were so genuine, but also so collaborative. He did not work in a silo. He worked with hundreds of people over the course of his career, and he was very good at working with people. So I wanted the interviews to have that kind of 360 experience where they looked at him from different angles.
Yeah. I'll ask one more question before we get to some from the audience. I know a few are keen, but I'm wondering about sort of the archive itself, and I'm wondering, there's this wealth of visual material. Were you going in there looking for specific things, or did the film kind of like, was it like a process of discovery and then the film kind of finds its structure? Because I feel like so much is structured by all this like wonderful archival material.
I was looking for him. I was looking for the interior life and emotional life. I was looking for, there was so much that I was looking for. So I don't want to like belabor the answer, but there's a macro and a micro answer. The macro is I was really looking for the man, and the material I found that did that was a treasure trove that no one knew existed. The family, nobody, was that there were different forms of media we were getting back that were just Zappa. Some of them are in the film. So he'd be sitting in his easy chair, the same easy chair he had in the 60s, he had on his deathbed in the 90s. And he would be talking to friends down in his office about what mattered to him and about what mattered to them. You guys getting me okay?
Yep, you're coming through.
Okay, great. So I heard an echo back, so I just want to make sure. And there were hours and hours of that. He would record himself either on film or on video or on audio. And if he did an interview with like someone from a radio station or Rolling Stone, he would say, come over to the house, you get your soundbite, I get a 2-hour interview with you, and I keep the interview and you go away. And he wasn't just pontificating, he was like engaging with people in a very direct way. And it was really lovely, and it was expansive. And Mike and I got that and thought, we're good. Like we actually have whether we want to use all of it or not, we basically have Zappa first person telling us his life from a very intimate viewpoint. So that was the gold we initially found, where we knew we were going to be able to make the movie we wanted. Then there were little specific things that mattered to me. I was personally very invested in his Garrick theater era. I come from a theater background, and I studied radical and experimental theater quite a bit, and I'm very interested in it. And I was very interested in someone, a rock artist, supposedly. I mean, I realized later he was not so much a rock artist, but certainly a pop culture artist who installed himself in an off-Broadway theater for a year, better part of a year, and just performed there from morning till night to audiences as they walked in and out. And often there wasn't music involved. They would just be doing like theatrical performances. And he formed his artistic identity doing that. And so I use that as an example of, like, I was also looking for certain chunks of his life to be conveyed visually that I knew were very fascinating. I was really grateful when I found the Garrick stuff. No one had ever seen that stuff before.
Yeah, it's a beautiful collection of material. A couple from the audience here. I have a question from Daniel. Can you describe the motif of the gas mask and what it represents about Zappa and his life? It's an image we see kind of throughout the film.
Yeah. Look, to Zappa, Lord only knows. Other than that, he, as he says himself, he was raised, we all know his background. His dad worked not for the military directly, but everyone in the sort of post-war period and during the war was involved in those types of things. And they were near the Edgewood Arsenal and working around the Edgewood Arsenal, and a lot of bomb raid warnings and gas masks in school and things like that. To Zappa, to us, the way we use it as a motif, hewing closely to Frank, it represented that sort of loss of innocence that you have when you're young and you realize there are scary things that happen in the world, and that those scary things can happen to you, and that there's really never any complete relief from that. And so Zappa would use that on stage in concerts and things like that. We thread it through the film as kind of a reminder of his loss of innocence in that way, of that child running around and realizing, oh, this thing we're playing with isn't a space helmet. It's actually, something that's used for war and for hurting people, or to protect you from being hurt. And there's an obvious arc in the film about his own maturation from being kind of a hedonistic, cynical, devil-may-care, quasi-political guy to someone who takes it very seriously and commits years of his life to traveling around the world trying to help with culture and global trade, which is not the guy we met in 1968. And I love his arc. It's a beautiful story. And so there's a representation in there too.
Yeah, that what you're saying reminds me of a moment early in the film when he's talking about how he made bombs at an early age, and he was just like looking for these like chemical juxtapositions and seeing what happens. There's this like
being radical, like trying to blow up his school, like being a real rabble rouser, and there are people who don't, there's punk rockers who you interview them today, 30 years later, and they're just as snarky and childlike. That was Zappa, in his early 50s, had matured greatly and was no longer just this sort of rabble rouser.
Yeah. We have a question from Eduardo asking, what was the most challenging aspect of pulling all the elements together to complete the film?
I mean, everything about this film was challenging. Yeah. Getting it made was hard. Archiving the media was hard. Chasing after, you would find a piece of visual gold. Remember, we're doing a lot of the work of pulling stuff out of boxes and identifying it. So we would find a reel of Super 8 or 16 that was absolute gold, and then realize, oh, right, this was made in the 60s. Sound was done separately. This is all MOS. We've got this incredible sequence and there's no sound. So we would cut it anyway, but it would be really useless without audio. And then we may not find the audio at all. We may find it a year later, or we may find a third of it and like an eighth of the last third of it. And that happened all the time. So that's kind of what it was like making this thing. And we just had to kind of keep plowing ahead and building the the architecture of it that we wanted to. So I'd say that was the most challenging thing.
Do you get the sense that it was like there was some organizing principle at one point in the vault that so you're talking about like things existing in different places, different physical spaces. Is this something that you think Frank will like put there intentionally and he could find the right pieces, or had it been like scrambled by the time you guys had?
It was pretty well organized, but there was a lot of it. There was a lot of it. So, and also some of it deteriorated. And so this is getting really technical, but sometimes what would happen is the film would be with the audio would be destroyed. We would say, oh, well, we can't use that. Then we'd be preserving audio and go, wait a minute, this is a dupe of the other film that we lost the audio to. I mean, that's what we were dealing with.
Yeah.
So we go, oh, okay, we can use this audio on that earlier piece of film because it looks better than the reduped. Because Frank was constantly reduplicating his media. That's one of the reasons there was so much of it. In fact, at a certain point financially, because we did not have infinite pockets, we were worried, like, gosh, should we keep going, or are we just preserving the same thing over and over again? But we realized, as I said earlier, there were subtle distinctions in the media because he was constantly manipulating it. We didn't want to miss any goals, so we just kept going.
Yeah. Sort of related to the archival material, B-Sides and Beers asks, what was the most exciting piece of tape you discovered while making the documentary? Did you get to hear any of the Zappa Clapton recordings?
Yes, I heard the Clapton. The Zappa family has the Clapton audio, which they're going to be releasing. I did hear that. It is not, to be honest, it's not something I could have really, I mean, they would have let me use it if I wanted to. There's nothing that would have really told my story. They're really just kind of farting around in front of a mixing booth. But they are going to release that at some point. I think we released a little of it on our Kickstarter for the backers. But there's no video, there was no film of it. Or absolutely, there's no visual representation of that experience. It is 100% just the audio. But that wasn't new. The family's known that was down there. I was really happy to see Joni Mitchell backstage. In terms of like fun rock stuff. I'm a huge Joni fan, and just, you know, there are just sequences for me as a filmmaker that I know from having done a lot of archival research just don't exist in the world, and it's going to be probably boring for the audience, but it was just for us, we were gobsmacked. And the Garrick Theater was one of those, as I mentioned, seeing the West Village in the late 1960s, being inside that theater was really a rush for me. But also, there's no footage of the Sunset Strip from that period. There's no footage of the whiskey of any value. It's impossible. And like, we started looking for that way before we started working on the film, and we were coming up completely empty-handed. And in fact, I had people like working on things about Manson and other stuff about old Hollywood coming to me asking them if I could help them. So when we found that footage, and it's such gorgeous footage of the Sunset Strip with the Harley Davidsons and the line around the block of the whiskey, it was really like being there. And I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah. Great. We have a couple of questions about interviews, maybe that weren't in the film. A question about Zappa's children and then Zappa's siblings are two questions. Was there consideration to maybe interview them, or?
Yeah, again, I really just wanted to talk primarily to people who had been in his band. And Pam Des Barres is kind of a de facto member of the band, as she, has famously said herself. But that was really my interest. If I could have gotten away without any interviews at all, I would have done it. Yeah. But I really did not want to I didn't want the film to be an objective sort of observance of Zappa. I wanted it to be inside Zappa's life and inside his emotional life. The other thing about the family was I was talking to Bob, but he passed away before we could figure out whether he could do an interview or not. He got sick and died. But structurally, we wanted the whole first, I think almost 30 minutes of the film, there's no interviews at all. And I really wanted Zappa's youth to be portrayed by Zappa himself through his home movies, through his archival, through his own words, so that by the time you got into the meat of the movie in the second act, when people do start sprinkling up to start talking, you really feel like you know who the guy is. He can seem impenetrable. I didn't want the movie to start with talking heads. I didn't want the movie to go, well, when I grew up with Frank, he was blah, blah, blah. I just didn't, it felt like the wrong way in. So that was also some of the thinking in terms of who was there. And in terms of the kids, it was a similar mindset. It was, you know, I really wanted people who had known Frank since the 60s, ideally, and knew him intimately, and could speak to him during the run of his whole life in that way. Otherwise, I was afraid I'd end up with a film that was more kind of an objective reminiscence than like feeling an experiential ride with the person himself.
Yeah, I think the lack of talking heads, it's an immersive thing. You mentioned that you feel that you're on the Sunset Strip with this certain footage. I think it comes off really, really nicely. I know we're short on time. This is a great question from Chris. Chris is wondering, Alex, if you could describe Frank in one word, what would it be?
It's really tough. Honestly, I would say avant-garde. I think he is truly fundamentally avant-garde in the real sense of that phrase. You know, I don't think he's that classifiable. He was insistently non-classifiable in his personal life. But I think looking at, you know, the only thing I have, I think, for myself as a thesis, having lived with him so long, because I think he was really an avant-garde musician above everything else. I don't think he was a rock and roll musician at all. I don't think he was a jazz musician. I think, you know, I hate to call him an avant-garde classical composer, but that's probably the closest thing one could say about him that's accurate. So I'd say avant-garde, because he was also avant-garde in his personal life, of course. So it's really kind of an across the board thing. I think he would loathe that if he was around. He would absolutely loathe that. But if I had to choose one word, that would be it. Which I know is really two words. I'm cheating, but that's the closest I got.
There's a hyphen. A lot of spellings have it.
There is. Yes, it is. It is a hyphen. Yeah.
So I think
I'll take the hyphen.
Yeah, there's a beautiful moment in the film where they talk about someone's talking about how he's this composer, but he can't afford an orchestra, so he was a rock musician for that idea.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, he genuinely loved to use those instruments. I don't think he disavowed those instruments. I don't think that he was someone who saw himself as above. You know, he wasn't just an orchestral composer. You know, he was a composer with those instruments, the way, you know, even Varese or sometimes Stravinsky would use crazy percussion or whatever. He did use rock instruments and rock tropes, but he wasn't really, you know, Lou Reed famously derided Frank as not having a rock and roll bone in his body, but I don't really think Frank wanted a rock and roll bone in his body.
Yeah. Well, Alex, I want to thank you for being here, for sharing your time with us, and for the, of course, amazing film. Zappa will be shown one night only theatrically on November 23rd, and then available everywhere on November 27th. So tell your friends.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was really great to be here.
Thanks, Alex. You take care.
Okay. Thank you.